It's now 3:15, isn't it? So we are going to crack on. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Simon Clark, and I'm director of the campaign group Forest, which stands for Freedom Organisation for the Right to Enjoy Smoking Tobacco. And we were founded in 1979, so that's 44 years ago. Now, I'm going to introduce our speakers in just a moment, but first I want to explain briefly the background to today's event. Now, today's discussion is actually extremely topical. In April, in response to last year's Khan review, Making Smoking Obsolete, the government announced three main initiatives. A task force to reduce the illegal sale of vapes to children, free vape kits to be given to up to 1 million smokers to entice them to switch, and pregnant women to be offered up to £400 to quit smoking. Now, in his speech at Policy Exchange in April, Public Health Minister Neil O'Brien also emphasised the government's belief in personal responsibility, which was, of course, music to our ears because the two principles on which Forest is based are freedom of choice and personal responsibility. Shortly before that announcement in April, The Times also reported that the government had rejected proposals to ban smoking in parks and pub gardens or to stop people under a certain age from ever buying cigarettes. 9 days ago, however, The Guardian reported that the Prime Minister is now considering introducing a New Zealand-style policy on the sale of cigarettes whereby the legal age of sale will rise by 1 year every year until no one can legally purchase cigarettes anymore. And it was also reported that the government might consider a ban on smoking in beer gardens and licensed pavement areas. And even vaping products aren't safe because there are currently demands to prohibit flavoured e-liquids and disposable vapes, which would deny adults legal access to a product that has helped many smokers quit a potentially more harmful habit. And nor are these proposals restricted to the present government. Earlier this year, Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting suggested that Labour might go further and simply ban the sale and purchase of cigarettes when it comes to power. Streeting also said that tackling smoking and vaping will be a priority for the next Labour government. Now, there's been talk that the Prime Minister is going to make an announcement in the next couple of days. And I'd like to make it clear now that if he even considers introducing this so-called generational ban on buying cigarettes, he will have a tremendous fight in his hands right up to the election because there are over 6 million smokers and they're voters too. And although it's not going to affect the vast majority of smokers, I can tell you that a lot of smokers and a lot of non-smokers like myself are fed up of government dictating to us all the time over what we eat, what we drink, and what we smoke. And if the government does go ahead with these measures, it'll be the most draconian anti-smoking policies since the introduction of the smoking ban, which was, of course, introduced by a Labour government. Furthermore, if it's true that the Prime Minister wants to introduce some of the world's toughest anti-smoking measures, denying millions of adults the freedom to choose, and potentially endangering the future of many more pubs with an outdoor smoking ban, I would argue that this will be a Conservative government in name only. Now, discuss these issues. I'm delighted to introduce our panel. We'll start from the left. Chris Snowdon is the head of lifestyle economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Chris is a regular contributor to The Spectator, The Telegraph, and Spiked magazine. He is the author of Polemics, Killjoys, Selfishness, Greed and Capitalism, The Art of Suppression, and Velvet Glove, Iron Fist, which is one of the best books you can ever read about the history of smoking. Most important, though, he is the editor of the Nanny State Index and vice president of Shoreham Snooker Club.
Yes, that's right.
Round of applause, please, for Mr.
Shoreham
Chris Snowdon.
Give it up for Shoreham Snooker Club.
Right. Woo! Now, on my far right, not politically, Mark Oates is the director of the consumer advocacy group We Vape. and a fellow of the Adam Smith Institute. Mark founded We Vape in 2020. He's an established harm reduction campaigner who successfully quit cigarettes with the help of vaping. Now, more important perhaps, Mark is also running a mini golf event at conference, which he says is mostly a piss-up. He's also described it as a political version of speed dating for shy people. So later on he might want to talk about that. But anyway, the event is sponsored by Mark's nicotine news and reviews website called The Daily Pouch. And last, and definitely not least, we have Reem Ibrahim, who is a graduate of the London School of Economics and Political Science. She is currently the Communications Officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs. She appears monotonously regularly on television and radio, including the BBC, LBC, GB News, Talk TV and Times Radio. She has written for CapEx, Conservative Home and The Telegraph, and Reem has a particular interest in tobacco harm reduction, and she has just co-authored with Christopher a short IA paper called A Vapid Solution, Why Banning Disposable E-Cigarettes Would Be a Failure of Law Enforcement. So would you please welcome our panel today. Now, just to, so they can explain why they're on the panel and what their expertise is, I'm going to very quickly ask them each to describe in a few words their own smoking history. So we'll start with Chris, who's clearly the oldest person on the panel, apart from myself. Chris, when did you start smoking and why? How did you quit? And most important, did any government policy ever play a role in your decision to quit?
I'm interested to hear that expertise is equivalent to smoking history, because you've got no smoking history at all.
None at
You're
all.
one of the country's great experts in this.
I'm merely chairing this wonderful panel.
I was a very enthusiastic and prolific smoker from the age of, not that old actually, about 16, 17, when it was legal in those days, at 16, till, when was it? 2011, I switched to vaping. 12 years ago, 35 I would have been. And I switched to vaping just because it was cheaper and healthier, really. I still identify as a smoker. I feel slightly ashamed of being a vapor, really. But I am one. I am what I am. Use the old nicotine pouches as well, which presumably will be banned at some point. So, yeah, I mean, look, my defense of smokers may initially have been slightly self-interested, but now I see it very much as being charitable.
Okay, Mark?
So I was 12. I was about 6'5", and me and my friend Adam Ellery, he was about 4'3", would steal cigarettes from his grandfather, the extra long ones, and smoke them in some bushes at his parents' house. I quit smoking when I flew back from China, where I was inhaling huge amounts of smog anyway. So I was smoking 50 pence a pack cigarettes, fake sort of Marlboro Lights. And I landed in Sweden, where I picked up some Swedish snus, and I thought it was chewing tobacco, bought it, tried it. It wasn't chewing tobacco, it was Swedish snus. Thought it was awesome, came back to the UK, continued consuming it, but because Swedish snus is illegal in the UK, I was forced by the government to go back to smoking. Which meant my health was damaged because of it, because Swedish snus is vastly safer than smoking. And then I would buy the Swedish snus off the criminal market, paying taxes to fund schools in Sweden, until I started to vape rather than smoke. That took about 5 years, that transition. I then would use snus when I could get hold of it, and then vape. And then now I use nicotine pouches and vape and get snus whenever I go to Sweden.
Okay, thank you. Reem?
So I'm a bit younger than the rest of the panel, so I don't have quite a 30-year history of smoking. But I started smoking when I was 15. I had my first cigarette when I was 15, and I thought it was pretty gross, didn't really like it. Then I had tried it again when I was, I think, between the ages of 16 and 17. During sixth form, my breakfast was a Black Americano and a Marlboro Gold. And then I continued to smoke during university. When I was at LSE, we actually had a smoking society. It was not an official society. Of course, the SE would have shut that down. But it was a sort of group chat where we'd all come together and smoke outside. And it was I met some of my closest friends through that smoking group chat. and we sort of smoked outside the library. Then I decided when I was 19 that I wanted to quit smoking. I started using nicotine pouches because, of course, as Mark said, snus is still illegal in this country. It was an EU-wide ban, so use our Brexit freedoms to get rid of that ban. And then about 2 years later, I decided to pick up smoking again because you only live once.
Thank you. Now, we're going to start with you, Reem, actually, because since The Guardian reported that the government was considering a New Zealand-style generational ban on buying cigarettes, you've been pretty outspoken on the subject. So can you please tell everybody what your thoughts are?
Yeah, so this is this New Zealand style ban is effectively an incremental increase in the age of sale of tobacco. So obviously at the moment it's 18 years old. You have to be 18 years old to buy tobacco products. And it originated from the Khan Review, which was published in, I believe, June last year. So the Khan Review effectively said, among many things, including the fact that vaping is an effective tool to help people quit smoking. It also said that the best way for us to, from a public health perspective, sort out the problem of smoking is to incrementally increase the ban. Now, I think that fundamentally this is about treating the adults of the future as though they will always be children. And I think that's absolutely wrong. As adults, we should be able to choose what we would like to do with our own bodies, what we would like to do with our own health. And ultimately, there is not one smoker in this country that doesn't know it's bad for them, and yet they still choose to do so. And there could be an amalgamation of different factors that go into those kind of decisions. But ultimately, I think that those individuals should be able to choose to smoke if they wish to.
But given the potential harm that can be caused by smoking, don't you think it's reasonable for governments to target a smoke-free future? And if that means prohibiting future generations from purchasing cigarettes, so be it.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the problem with government targets. Same thing with net zero. We want the United Kingdom to be net zero by 2030, or now it's 2050. It means that then what comes after that is an amalgamation of other policies in order to try and achieve that goal. Similar thing here with the smoke-free England by 2030 target. What that does mean is that ultimately the government are then forced to try and meet that target, and so they're forced to then implement these kind of policies that, of course, the public health lobby want. Now, I say if we do want to see the United Kingdom smoke-free, ultimately, if that's the government's wish, they should adopt the harm reduction model. If you look at countries like Sweden, where nicotine pouches or snus is sort of prolific, it's sort of part of the culture. That they have minuscule lung cancer rates, and they have I think the smoking population is about less than 5%. So really, they've achieved what is effectively a smoke-free country. If we want to reduce smoking rates, if we want to see this country effectively be more healthy, then we should adopt a harm reduction model and ultimately let adults choose.
Okay, right, Christopher. What are your thoughts on the reports that we've been hearing about the government's new anti-smoking measures?
I find it very hard to believe that a Conservative government would introduce it, but who knows? Anything could happen. I thought Rishi's been having quite a good run the last couple of weeks, announcing some policies that are not particularly popular with the blowhards on Twitter, but actually seem to be quite popular with the general public in terms of heat pumps and net zero and speed limits on the road. So I don't know why he would commit this sort of unforced error, something that nobody's really asking for outside of a lunatic fringe, and introduce this incremental prohibition. I mean, apart from being a liberal, as Reem says, it seems to me fairly impractical and absurd. I mean, if it goes on for any length of time, which is presumably the point, you will very quickly end up with 25-year-olds not being able to buy cigarettes and 26-year-olds being able to buy cigarettes. And I guess the 26-year-olds won't feel any moral compunction against buying cigarettes for a 25-year-old. Most of us probably wouldn't buy cigarettes for an 11-year-old, but buying one for a 25-year-old would probably seem not particularly unethical. And then the newsagent at the corner shop is going to have to ask your age and then presumably look at a chart and work out whether you're allowed to buy cigarettes even though you're very clearly an adult with a beard, or not. I mean, the whole thing is kind of preposterous, really. I think at the very least we should wait to see how it plays out in New Zealand. I don't think it's going to play out very well. There's a bit of a misunderstanding, if I may just go on a slight tangent, about what the New Zealand model actually is. It's not just about raising the age of purchase every year until ultimately in a century nobody can buy cigarettes. They're also doing two other things. One is they're reducing the number of shops that can legally sell cigarettes from the current 6,000 down to 600. Now, effectively, this gives a golden ticket to anybody who's allowed to sell cigarettes, because suddenly you've got 10 times as many customers, give or take. But even more importantly than that, they are taking the nicotine out of cigarettes, which is a loony idea that's floated around in tobacco control for decades, and it's never got any traction because somebody, even in the public health lobby, will say, that's stupid, it's not going to work. Nobody wants to buy cigarettes that have no nicotine in them, and therefore, rather than give up smoking, they're just going to buy them on the black market. The black market is already massive in this country. It's getting bigger and bigger in New Zealand, the kind of country where you think we'll never have a black market because it's so far from anywhere. There's not many smokers there. No one's going to, sail a ship down from Indonesia or China to serve relatively small numbers of smokers in New Zealand. I mean, in fact, the black market is growing in New Zealand. It's massive in Australia. So the idea of ultra-low nicotine cigarettes is ridiculous. It's never going to take off. It's a form of prohibition. And this, of course, is a form of prohibition. It's just a form of prohibition that isn't going to get any adverse reaction from anyone on self-interested grounds who is old enough to vote. Because the people who are going to be affected by this are, by definition, under the age of 18 at the moment. And if you're particularly dull-witted, you consider these people children now, and therefore I don't like children smoking. Well, they're not going to be children for much longer. They're going to be adults, at which point, why can't they buy cigarettes? Now, if you don't think that any adult should buy cigarettes, then you're quite consistent in saying that these people shouldn't be able to buy cigarettes in 10 years' time. But if you don't believe anyone should buy cigarettes, just say that. Just come out and say that you're a prohibitionist. This is the most frustrating thing about the anti-smoking lobby for decades, is the weasel words, the salami slicing, the incrementalism of the whole thing, all the while saying, oh, we don't, of course we don't want to stop adult smoking if they want to do that. Of course we respect the choice of adults. And they've said this again and again with every piece of anti-smoking legislation, smoking ban, graphic warnings, plain packaging, endless tax rises. They always say, oh, well, this is just to protect children. We're quite happy for adults, if they want to do that, to smoke. Anybody who understands their mentality knew that it was always a lie. It was always duplicitous. And anybody who supports this prohibition, albeit a weird form of prohibition, just needs to admit that they're a prohibitionist. Can they finally do that? Just once and for all, just admit that they were lying to us all along. That it's always been about prohibition. And probably in various other areas of public policy, where it's alcohol, ultra-processed food, gambling, many of them actually are prohibitionists on that as well.
Okay, I was going to ask you about the economics of these policies, but we'll come back to that because I want to bring Mark in. Now, Mark, you're a vaping advocate, so I would imagine perhaps that you would welcome the news that the government's considering these further anti-smoking measures. I mean, how would you react?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's entirely illiberal. The idea that you can vote at 18 years old but not buy a pack of cigarettes and someone a year older can, I think is pretty mad. And of course, join the military and fight for our country. So I think that's ridiculous. And the army actually introduced a smoke-free policy, but I can tell you it's not working. I mean, I know that soldiers on Salisbury Plain were told they had to leave Salisbury Plain during exercise, but the officers quite smartly realised this was a terrible thing to do and allowed those soldiers to smoke. Frankly, I think if you're in the military, you've probably got bigger things on your plate in terms of the likelihood of you dying than something that could happen in long term in the future. What the army should have done is had a more positive harm reduction approach and encouraged their soldiers to use nicotine pouches and vape and potentially heat not burn. Those were the policies that would work. And again, what you could do for the broader population, rather than banning cigarettes for certain age groups, is make sure smokers are aware that vaping is vastly safer. Over 50% of smokers are not aware that it's safer. And we know that's preventing them actually switching over to something that is vastly safer. So we could have pack inserts in cigarettes that inform the smokers of the facts, a health message from the chief medical officer to tell them of the facts. And very importantly, there's a complete misunderstanding that nicotine is in any way damaging to your health. It's got similar health risks as caffeine. But no one's talking about having a caffeine-free society. The thing that harms you when you smoke a cigarette is the combustion of plant matter. If you smoke tea, it would be pretty bad for you. And just finally on this age thing, we all know that person at school or in The Great Escape, the scrounger that got hold of products. But there's always that guy at school who was 6'5" and would be the one that went to the shop to buy the magazines, to buy the beers, to buy the cigarettes. And they would have quite a roaring trade. And this is a smuggler's charter for young people, not just at school, but, you know, when you imagine at university being in a situation where a year older can buy cigarettes, you know, they'll be making huge amounts of money. So flawed policy, in my view.
Okay, I'll come back to pack inserts a bit later so that you can all comment on that. But do you see some of these policies actually being a potential threat to vaping as well? Because we all know that the sort of direction of travel is towards prohibition, currently with combustible tobacco. But the anti-smoking lobby are always looking for the next logical step. So once the template is in place, surely it's going to apply to all forms of nicotine.
Absolutely, and they do seem to want a nicotine-free society, and we see the World Health Organization, who are meeting in November in Panama, who talk about trying to remove nicotine. Reem has mentioned Sweden, where they've reached smoke-free, not by preventing people using nicotine, but switching them onto a safer alternative. And frankly, I do some work on HIV, and we didn't stop people having sex to prevent HIV transmission. We implemented harm reduction. We've got condom use, and now recently PrEP, which a pill you take once a day. If you're at risk of HIV, you do not get HIV. People are and will use nicotine. I don't know of a society where they've used nicotine and then suddenly stopped using nicotine. All we can do is switch them to a safer version of nicotine. And yeah, I think they've come for you and they'll come for us. Part of the argument for vaping and nicotine pouches is the fact it's 95% safer. But if they're claiming, you know, that cigarettes aren't being used, you don't really have that comparison, and they'll probably try and get the 5%, which there probably isn't even that 5% level of harm in comparison to cigarettes, to be honest.
Okay. Well, let's quickly talk about disposable vapes, because they're also under threat. Let's talk about banning them. I mean, we're told there's a vaping epidemic in UK schools. Do you agree that there is a problem that needs to be addressed, and how should the government address it?
Yeah, well, clearly, disposable vapes have come along. And firstly, why have they come along? Well, because some policy was introduced in America which banned pod systems. So bad regulation came in, and then the Chinese manufacturers found a way of circumnavigating that regulation. And then they looked for a new market, the UK. There is a problem in schools and young people. I think it is a moral panic. It's like a moral panic we had when it came to Alka Pops many years ago. The answer is to try and prevent these young people breaking the law, because that's what they're doing. They're breaking the law, and also the people that are selling to them. And I think you could have a licensing system if you want to sell vapes. You pay £100 or £200 to sell vapes, and that money could then go to trading standards, and they could do age checks, challenge 25, to try and fine people that are selling these products to underage consumers. And they should be big fines. I mean, I've heard of fines of £30 for vape shops selling to under 18s. I mean, that is ridiculous. We should be having fines of £10,000, shutting down their shops. But that's the route, and that is the answer, because not only will the prohibition of disposable vapes or even cigarettes not is illiberal, I don't think it'll actually work, because you'll create a huge black market. Australia, vaping is banned. You can try and get it through prescription model, but it's very difficult. And they still have a huge number of people using disposable and non-disposable vapes. So clearly a ban isn't working, and it's flooding money into gangs. I don't know how you can look at the drugs market and go, yeah, that's working really well. That's what I want to do. I want to create a new criminal market, a new product that criminals can make money and sell to my kids. I mean, at the moment, the system has at least some age verification, which we should improve, but banning disposable vapes will remove all age verification.
Okay. Well, can I go to all panelists and basically now ask, how would you like to, I mean, if tobacco and if vapes are going to be regulated, obviously in case of tobacco, further regulated, how would you like to see it regulated, and how would you like to see vapes regulated? So we'll start with Chris.
Well, tobacco is massively over-regulated, and there's no possible sensible extra bit of regulation that could possibly apply to tobacco that I can think of. I mean, smokers are treated virtually as second-class citizens. A pack of cigarettes is so expensive, I can't believe anybody buys them in this country rather than buy them on the black market or go abroad. So yeah, I'm certainly not going to be pushing for any more anti-tobacco regulation. Vaping, vaping is pretty heavily regulated as is. We have the EU regulations that came in 2016. That bans a whole load of additives from being put in e-cigarettes. When you hear about e-cigarettes having heavy metals or various nasty substances, it's because the e-cigarettes themselves are illegal. There was a case reported by the BBC a few months ago. They'd gone to a school, they confiscated various vapes. They were found to have potentially dangerous levels of various chemicals in them. Every single one of those vapes was illegal. This is the problem we're facing with this youth vaping so-called epidemic. It's not just, as Mark says, it's not just that they're being sold illegally to kids, it's that the vapes themselves are very, very often illegal. They do not comply with the EU regulations, which are now the UK regulations. And we're not enforcing either of those laws, so why are we, what makes us think we're going to enforce a prohibition on it? I don't think there's a lot more to be done. I'm quite sympathetic to what Mark says about maybe licensing retailers. If it's a relatively small fee and if it goes to trading standards, I think that actually could make a certain amount of sense. I'd have to look at the details there. But certainly the fine should be heftier for the illegal sale of vapes, and trading standards should be doing their job, not just in stopping underage sales, but in stopping the illegal vapes being sold to anybody. We have the laws on the books in this country, and we really should. You can say this about so many areas of public policy, but it's a particularly glaring example here. We have the laws, we're not enforcing them. There's no reason why a child should be able to buy vapes easier than they can buy tobacco or vodka. I know occasionally teenagers do get hold of tobacco and vodka, and it's unreasonable to expect that these kind of problems are ever going to be eradicated. But it's a hell of a lot harder to get hold of spirits and cigarettes than it is to get hold of vapes, and there's no reason why that should be.
Okay, Reem?
Yeah, I mean, just to follow on from what Chris just said with regard to alcohol and young people, twice as many 11 to 15-year-olds drink alcohol regularly than vape regularly. So I think it's really important that when we're thinking about the sort of vaping epidemic and the sort of the moral panic, as Mark said, the reality is really not as stark as people make it out to be. Just to answer your question, Simon, in terms of regulation is there to achieve a particular goal, and if the goal is to reduce or take away vaping products from under 18s, the regulations are already in place. It's young people under 18s are already not allowed to buy these vaping products. As Chris has said, for some reason it seems to be the case that they are more easily able to access vaping products, and especially disposable vapes, than they are other products that are also banned for under 18. So the solution there is not more legislation, it's not more regulation, it's the enforcement of existing laws. And that comes down to, I mean, again, you could introduce a sort of return scheme where effectively means that you have to have a license in order to sell these kind of products. But I think that when it comes to vaping itself, and especially disposable vapes, the regulations are already in place. It's about enforcement, not further regulation.
Okay. Now, Mark, we've already covered it a bit from your angle already. I want to ask another question of all three panellists, which is this: what are the politics behind the government's apparent change of heart on smoking? Now, the reason I mention this is because I'm getting on a bit now, and I've become a bit cynical, I'm afraid, about politicians over the years and governments generally. And I remember back in 2015 when David Cameron suddenly changed his mind about plain packaging of tobacco. Up until that point, up until a few months before the general election, he showed no interest really in pushing through plain packaging. But then allegedly he was advised by his election advisor to, quote, get the barnacles off the boat, by which was meant get rid of any issue that might crop up during the general election campaign and might be awkward. Now, Labour were pushing very, very hard for plain packaging. So Cameron suddenly decided, oh yes, we'll introduce plain packaging so it won't be an election issue. Now, God forbid that Rishi Sunak is thinking along similar lines, but we know that Labour want to introduce some very draconian regulations on smoking if they get into power. So I just would be interested to know all the panellists' views on what are the politics behind this recent development. Mark, start with you.
I sometimes think that politicians find it so difficult to do things that are actually effective, sort out the economy, make those difficult choices, maybe cut corporation tax, help our economy grow to make more jobs, grow our businesses. They're so unable to do those things that they look for these tiny little things that only affect a small part of the population. And I do find it odd that we do, as the smoking rates come down and down, the smokers have been attacked more and more. And in other areas of policy, they would be seen as a sort of minority that shouldn't be kicked, but smokers are kicked. And the attitude is that smokers, frankly, should quit or they should die, which is the complete wrong attitude to have. We should be helping these people understand there's a safer alternative if they want it, not through prohibition, not through the stick. So yeah, I mean, I think we get the politicians we deserve, and unless we can really make the public look for the long term, then we're going to continue with an economy that continue to get smaller and smaller as the government sort of makes small changes, causes a problem, such as the energy price cap, and then fixes the problem when the energy price cap goes too high because of energy prices by subsidising it. I think we need a revolution here, and the woman that could do it was the Prime Minister in the 1980s, and sadly she's not around, and I can't really see anyone appearing anytime soon.
Okay. Funnily enough, I did ask the panellists before we came on if they could give us the odd soundbite, and we just had one from Mark. I think we need a revolution, so feel free to tweet that. Reem, what about you?
The politics of the nanny state. I think it is about control. And I ultimately do believe that the government want to take away a lot of those individual freedoms because they believe that, from a public health perspective, that this is acceptable. Now, we've got to remember, we have a National Health Service, and so because the government control our healthcare, the government also control our health. That means that if you are, as an individual, wanting to make particular decisions about your own health, you are not liable for those costs. The government, the taxpayer is, the average taxpayer is. And what that means is that your own lifestyle decisions are then controlled by the state. The government has a political interest and also a financial interest in your health, because the healthier you are, the less you use the National Health Service, the less resources are being used. So I really do think that this is about a wide, the politics of the nanny state is about a wider question of socialised healthcare and ultimately government control over your healthcare. If the government are controlling the way in which you're able to receive that kind of healthcare, then of course they're going to have an interest in what you do with your own body, and then of course consequentially have an interest in the health of your body and what you do with that. So that would include things like smoking. Now, I'm not really sure about the potential disposable vapes ban, to be completely honest. I think that this is about a moral panic, and it's about responding immediately to these kind of news questions, and you've got lots of mums on Mumsnet complaining about their kids vaping, and effectively that's resulted in the government responding in this way. I think it's a very quick response. I think it's one of those things that is going to be difficult to overturn. But when it comes to smoking, it really is to do with the way in which our healthcare system is set up.
Okay, I'm just going to go to Chris, but also if anybody wants to ask a question or make a point, we'll come to the audience after Chris has spoken.
The plain packaging was quite interesting from a political science point of view, because it was a very low salience issue with nearly everybody in practice. A tiny number of anti-smoking campaigners were very keen on it, and nobody else particularly cared, including David Cameron, but he opened a consultation. As soon as he opened a consultation, he opened a can of worms, and it then became, are you going to do this or not? And the advisor that Simon mentions was, of course, Linton Crosby. And one of the biggest news angle around plain packaging was that Linton Crosby had, his company was a lobbying company. One of their clients was a tobacco company. And so the fact that Cameron said, actually, we want to wait for the evidence to come from Australia, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and what we should do in New Zealand, I would suggest. This was then twisted to be, Cameron's been influenced by his advisor, who's been influenced by Philip Morris, and therefore this is the government in the pocket of the tobacco industry. Now, bearing in mind this is a low salience issue, that introducing it wouldn't cost the government anything. There was really politically no reason why Cameron wouldn't do what he did, which is we're just going to do plain packaging. That will scrape the barnacles off the boat. There won't be any more allegations or insinuations that I've been improperly influenced by Linton Crosby. So they did it. You can totally see, if you look at it impartially, you can see why he did it. Because there was going to be very little backlash from smokers, the adverse effect on smokers would be basically they've got a more ugly pack. Their life is slightly less happy because they've got an ugly pack. The policy hasn't worked, by the way. If you look at the data, it's had absolutely no effect whatsoever. In fact, the people who campaign for it never even mention it again now. But from Cameron's perspective, this is a low salience issue, but the risks of doing it were much smaller than the risks of not doing it. Now, the problem with that is it suggests that Cameron didn't really have any principles at all. He was just going with the flow. And again, in political science, you kind of expect people to be motivated by their incentives. They want to get re-elected. An election was on its way. But it is concerning, I would suggest, that you don't have politicians who have any principles. They want a legacy. The smoke-free 2030 thing was just Theresa May, having ballsed up Brexit, decided she needed some kind of legacy. Net zero was Johnson's way of having a legacy. Perhaps if Rishi Sunak goes with this ludicrous New Zealand policy, that will be his way of having legacy. But there are very, very few political costs to this, not least because, as Mark said, smokers are a smaller and smaller minority. And we tend to protect minorities generally in politics. If anything, politicians are obsessed with protecting minorities, unless those people are minorities because of their own personal choices. If you choose to become a minority, if you're a minority because you've chosen to engage in a minority pastor, that's different. That you can be persecuted for that. You can become a second-class citizen. We can do anything to you, not least because you're probably politically disenfranchised and are not likely to kick up much of a stink. So, unfortunately, the incentives in politics do work towards these grandstanding nanny state policies being announced by politicians, often many years in advance, because they really won't feel any political backlash if it's something that's in the future, which smoke-free 2030 and these other things I mentioned have been.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, let's go to questions. Right, the first gentleman, Kiram.
Hi, we've talked, there's a lot of sort of statements around the New Zealand style sort of ban, but what about the experiences of South Africa, and what do the panels think of that?
Well, Christopher is the expert on South Africa. Thank goodness.
Well, during COVID, the South African government took advantage of the situation, really, of having lockdowns to say, actually, we're going to stop people buying tobacco as well, and vapes, and alcohol. You'll never guess what happened. People didn't stop vaping, smoking, and drinking alcohol. They started buying it from neighboring countries. There was an enormous black market. It was a fairly large one to begin with, but it was a much larger one thereafter. There was no drop in the smoking rate or indeed the drinking rate. If anything, it probably exacerbated COVID because people were going off meeting people in other people's houses to buy these products illicitly. At one point during the lockdowns in 2020, a quarter of the population of the world lived in a country where alcohol was illegal, because South Africa wasn't the only place to do this, and a fifth of the world lived somewhere where it was illegal to buy e-cigarettes. There's some places like Australia is already to buy illegal to buy e-cigarettes. I could have got that the wrong way around, actually. I think it was maybe a quarter e-cigarettes and a fifth alcohol. Either way, many people, because the government decided, well, we've taken this much power, well, let's do the things that we've always wanted to do anyway. If public health are in control this year, let's really go for it. And look, it was obviously a disaster. Prohibition has always been a disaster, always will be a disaster. So long as there is demand for a product, people will buy it on the illicit market. We already have at least 1 in 9 cigarettes smoked in this country are bought on the black market. That's according to the government's own figures. And the government's own figures, in my view, are very unreliable. I think I actually have a pack here. Look, I picked this up outside the snooker club. You mentioned I was a vice president of the snooker club. I picked this up outside Shoreham Snooker Club at the weekend. And I recognised it immediately. I'd only ever read about this. I'd never seen a pack of Manchester cigarettes. Very appropriate that we're in Manchester. This is not a legitimate brand of cigarette. It never has been a legitimate brand of cigarette. It has no warning on it, you'll notice. So it hasn't been sold legally in the UK or the EU or indeed most countries. This first came on my radar when Australia introduced plain packaging. And suddenly the black market was flooded, not with people trying to imitate the plain packs, interestingly enough, but with people with cigarettes that went completely in the other direction. Full packaging with no warnings on it. And these are made somewhere in the Middle East. and they're designed entirely for illegal sale. And to find this on the streets of Shoreham, I thought was rather interesting. There is an enormous black market in cigarettes in this country, and you can understand why, given that a pack is 13, 14, 15 pounds. Prohibition does not work. It will never work. Mark's already given you, and Reem have already given you, a much better alternative to this. If you want to get the smoking rate down, it's to give people viable alternatives.
Very good. Well, that answer took us from South Africa to Manchester to Shoreham via the Middle East. So excellent. Right. Gentleman over here at the back. Yeah. And then I'll come to you, sir, next.
Hello. While I totally respect the argument for freedom of choice, and you've recognised that cigarettes have a detrimental effect on your health, how can you consolidate the fact that the taxpayer in our socialised medicine society has to, eventually subsidise your potentially more frequent visits to the doctor?
Whoa. Right, who wants to? I can't answer that, but somebody else ought to.
Speaking as someone from an economic think tank, it really is not true for various reasons people don't want to hear. But
taxes.
Well, firstly, it's enormously taxed. So there's about £14 billion in tax revenue that the government wouldn't get if it made cigarettes illegal. That more than covers any plausible cost of the NHS treatment of smokers, even if you disregard, as the anti-smoking groups tend to do, even if you disregard the fact that, let's be blunt about this, smokers do not live as long, and people who don't live as long do not have as much health care. They don't have all the cataract operations and the hip operations and the cancers and so on that afflict people who are much older, let alone indeed the pensions and the free TV license and the fuel subsidies and all the other things. The reality is, if the NHS is going to collapse, as people keep claiming, it will be because of lots of geriatrics. It will not be because of lots of smokers.
And you have a point, don't you, Reem, about the NHS?
Yes, no, I was just going to say, I mean, as I think it's about 85% of the price of cigarettes is tax. And I think it's interesting with conversations about the way in which our socialised healthcare system actually works. Obviously, as a result of, and as I made the argument earlier, that, because the government control our healthcare, they also control our health, and they have an interest in our health, and that's why they want to reduce the cost of healthcare. But ultimately, smokers do subsidise the rest of the country's healthcare. Actually, if you want to save the NHS, buy more cigarettes, because you'll be spending more of that taxpayer money onto our National Health Service. So I think it's, we've got to think about this in the broader context of the way in which sin taxes actually work. If you are a smoker, you are paying significantly more tax over your lifetime than any other individual.
Okay, I asked for sound bites, but maybe not that one. Mark, do you have
Well, I just want to quickly talk about prohibition in South Africa. Flipping it around a bit, rather than looking at places where things have been banned, look at places where things have been legalised. So the Netherlands has a much more liberal approach to cannabis than the UK, and they have a lower consumption of cannabis. States in America where they've legalised cannabis have not seen an increase in consumption of cannabis. There is a flawed belief that by banning something you stop it happening. That is not the case. And it comes back to what Chris was saying when the BBC did this report into these illegal vapes. And I was listening to the radio, I think it's Jeremy Vine or something, and people were bleating on about what the answer should be. They said the answer should be banning the product which is already banned, which makes no sense.
Okay. Gentleman here, and then here.
It's just a general question about public health generally. I mean, it feels like there's a lot of noise that endlessly comes from this lobby. What's a more effective way to take the battle against them rather than endlessly fighting defensive wars?
Anybody want to?
Well, I was going to say, I think Chris has been fighting this battle for longer than I've been alive.
I think we have to be honest. Which is some people in tobacco control are killing people. I projected recently around London a mini documentary, and it talked about the fact there's 1.1 billion smokers around the world. That figure hasn't changed in about 30 years. It's not going to change. This isn't just about the UK, this is about the world as well. And 7 million people a year die from smoking. The only conceivable way we're going to reduce that is switching people over to safer alternatives. One issue with vapes in terms of the developing countries is they're prohibitively expensive. They've worked well in the UK because cigarettes are taxed to a level which means vapes are cheaper. But that doesn't work. I was in Africa recently. because the vape's more expensive than cigarettes. So nicotine pouches are perfect for it. They can be produced at a similar price to cigarettes. If we actually recognised that the number of people dying from smoking is more than HIV, malaria and poverty combined, and cared about it, we could do something about it. This is potentially an international development issue. We spend lots of money on all those other issues, but for this one, for some reason, people believe that it's the fault of the smoker and they shouldn't be helped, which is something we had the same view in the 1980s with gay men contracting HIV. It was immoral, and it also was bad for the health of the people. This attitude is bad for the health of the people. The only way is harm reduction. We'll have this conversation in 50 years. The smoking rate will still be the same across the globe if we don't choose safe alternatives.
I think also I just want to make the point that a number of battles that we've fought over the years, we've actually been winning those battles, and then politics has intervened. I remember the smoking ban, for example. The battle about the smoking ban lasted 3, 4, 5, 6 years. At one point, we were even winning the argument about passive smoking. A report came out in 2003 that said the effects of passive smoking were actually much less than people were being led to believe. And at that point, we thought, fantastic, we're going to stop smoking being banned in pubs and clubs. And Labour went into the 2005 general election, for example, with a manifesto that actually tried to find a compromise, giving exemptions to pubs that didn't serve food. Then the then Health Secretary, John Reid, was replaced by Patricia Hewitt, and suddenly the politics changed. I mentioned earlier about plain packaging. The politics suddenly changing, and plain packaging was introduced. But actually, we'd been winning that debate and that battle for several years before that. And also, there are still a lot of battles that, we have won. I remember back in 2008, 2009, after the smoking ban had come in, Labour were talking about banning smoking in the doorways of pubs. And they lost the election in 2010. But the subsequent coalition government didn't go any further with that particular policy, partly because we kicked up a real storm at the time and said this is absolutely ridiculous. When there was an attempt to ban smoking in licensed pavement areas in 2020, again, we fought that, and that still hasn't happened. So I'm not sure, maybe I've misunderstood your question, but basically, there are a lot of battles that we haven't always won them in the long term, but we have delayed introduction of legislation, and that might seem to be pretty small beer, but from a campaigning point of view, we've had to be sort of happy with that sometimes. But there are, plenty of issues. I mean, for another one, for example, 10 years ago, there was talk about banning smoking in all private vehicles, not just vehicles that have children, but all private vehicles. Again, that hasn't been introduced because, again, we kicked up an absolute stink about it and said you cannot ban smoking in all private vehicles, especially if there's not a child present, because it comes down to an issue of choice. So the freedom of choice and personal responsibility arguments still have a great deal of punch in this country. I say, up until very recently, the government was talking about personal responsibility in relation to smoking and vaping. So we're certainly not going to go away because we think those arguments, and indeed the nanny state arguments, are still relevant. Maybe we need to use a different phrase from nanny state. It's slightly cliched these days. But the arguments behind the nanny state will not go away, and we'll still be fighting them. Sorry, gentleman here. And then here.
Hello, I'm Jack Smith, Leicestershire. So basically, this debate about prohibition and the negatives of it, like about tobacco, it reminds me of another debate. So marijuana, it's long been said that it's dangerous because it's the gateway drug, but the reason why it's the gateway drug is because the dealers that tend to sell this unrefined, unregulated stuff also sell the harder drugs like cocaine, heroin and whatnot. But if you legalised marijuana, that would knock out the idea of it being a gateway drug, and you can also whack a tax on it, bring in some extra tax revenue.
I totally agree with you, sir. We should absolutely be legalising marijuana, and yeah, the gateway rhetoric is war on drugs rhetoric, which is now being used about vaping, saying that vaping is a gateway to tobacco. It just isn't. It's the absolute opposite. People who vape are less likely. You look at them as individuals, less likely to start smoking. This is clear if you look at the data. Children in this country, or indeed America, you've seen this enormous rise, relatively speaking, in vaping use across the population, including, unfortunately, underage people. I say unfortunately, it's had a prophylactic effect, actually. If you want to be realistic about it, it is the smoking amongst 11 to 15-year-olds in this country has virtually been wiped out. And it's about 1%. Even only 10, 11 years ago, it was about 8%. Smoking anywhere where vaping has become popular is dying out much more quickly than it is in other countries, and particularly amongst underage people. There is no gateway effect. It is a gate away from smoking.
Okay, rather than go around the panelists, I want to get in 2, 3 more questions. So, gentlemen here.
2 quick points. On the sort of proposed smoking ban, or it's kind of sneaking away because it's trying to ratchet it up over time, but is an argument that we could use in terms of rallying the smokers in the general population, that once it gets so ridiculous that you have 25-year-olds not being able to buy it and 26-year-olds being able to buy it, that's the point where it'll just be like, why don't we just ban it altogether?
Exactly.
So we can use the slippery slope argument. And then on the point about vapes and the government being, stronger in telling the public that it is safer than smoking, what about the possibility of that not having the intended effect, in the sense that people are becoming more sceptical of what the government tells them on vaccines or whatever? Could that have a sort of unintended consequence of people being less likely to believe it?
Yeah, can I come on the first one? So I think it's interesting with the communication of these arguments. So I work in comms at the IEA, and ultimately I want to sit here and make the first principles argument and say, actually, we should have the right to smoke, the right to drink, the right to vape if we so wish to, because ultimately we should have the freedom to do so. And as individuals, we should have that right to live our lives in the way that we wish to. But obviously that argument doesn't land with many people, and so we communicate the ideas that actually, again, the harm reduction model based on evidence across the world is more effective at reducing smoking rates. We make the argument that, consequentially, when we're looking across the world and actually seeing those the public health lobby where they've actually won many of those policy battles, actually cause a great deal of harm to many people. So I think it's about communicating those ideas itself, and as much as I want to make the freedom argument everywhere because I am a libertarian, I also think that making those consequentialist arguments are important. And on the second question about people listening to what the government tells them, I do think that post-pandemic people are very, very happy generally to accept what the government tells them. We all accepted, including myself, the government telling us that we weren't allowed to leave our homes. So for almost 2 years, I think it's important to note that when it comes to the way in which this country, the way that the general population itself think about the impact or the impact that the government can have on them, people generally quite accepting of governments telling them to do those things.
You've been quite far-sighted there. I'm pleased to see it, because you realise what's actually going to happen with this. Okay, we're sat around talking about, well, this is just absurd. You get to a point where a 27-year-old can buy cigarettes and a 26-year-old can't. If this policy came in a few years' time, it wouldn't just be us saying it, everybody would be saying it, including the anti-smoking groups. They'd be saying, actually, this is a bit weird, isn't it? You've got 27-year-olds come out, 26-year-olds come out. Let's just have a level playing field and ban it for everyone. If it's all right to ban it for 26-year-olds, it's all right to ban it for 62-year-olds. This is the way it's going. This is a slippery slope. When people will say the slippery slope's a fallacy, well, strictly speaking, it does not necessarily follow that A goes to B to C to D, but tell me when it hasn't in tobacco. When has a slippery slope fallacy ever been an actual fallacy when it comes to smoking? It's obvious where these people are going. The end point has always clearly been the eradication and prohibition of tobacco, and anybody in the public health lobby who claims otherwise, after so many years of them salami slicing away at people's freedoms and making it very clear that in a few years' time they would be quite happy to ban 25-year-olds or 35-year-olds or whatever from buying cigarettes. These people cannot be trusted. If you believe that the government should prohibit anybody from buying cigarettes, which a significant minority of the public do, to be fair, 20% of the people believe in closing casinos and nightclubs forever, as we found out during COVID. There's a very anti-social minority of people in this country, and I would say we should try and ignore them. But if you believe that, just say it. Let's stop messing around at this point when we talk about incremental prohibition. Let's stop pretending that you're not a prohibitionist. Let's have this a straight fight. I'm a libertarian, you're a prohibitionist. Who's right? What are the consequences going to be? Let's be honest about this for the first time ever.
Okay, I'm sorry, we're going to go to one last question to the panel, because we've got 5 minutes left. Now, at our fringe meeting at last year's think tent, on the panel was Baroness Fox, also known as Claire Fox, Director of the Academy of Ideas, and Claire finished that event by saying, "I'm on the left, and I'm far more pro-freedom than anyone I've met in the Conservative Party. What has happened to you lot? You have lost your bottle, in my opinion." And she was absolutely right, I have to say. Many of us don't see much difference between Labour and the Conservatives on lifestyle issues, whether it's eating, drinking or smoking. So when it comes to individual freedom and the nanny state, I'm going to ask each of the panellists, is there any reason why anyone should vote Conservative at the next election? And we'll start with Mark.
I don't think there's any reason to vote. There's no reason to vote Labour, that's for sure. I think I'll probably vote Conservative with my sort of fingers crossed, partly because I don't like their liberal policy on independent education. And that's partly self-interest, and partly I genuinely think it's awful where society tries to steer people towards only state education, frankly. I know this is completely off topic, but I'd ban state schools if I was in charge. That's probably why I wouldn't be in charge. But we'd all be better off with
Sell them all off.
as little politician involvement in our children's education as possible. It's not great, it's not perfect. We missed the boat with a potential Prime Minister that could have been very good on these things. And I don't know, I think the Conservative Party needs to do better to get more people into seats that actually have a political backbone. I think the whole centralised system of deciding who's going to have a seat leads to people with no backbone who will just do what the party wants and follow the whip. And that's a great shame, because some of our best politicians have been people with an independent thought process.
I mean, I care more about ideas and policy initiatives rather than party politics. But what I will say is, we currently have the highest tax burden since the Second World War. Young people are unable to afford their own homes because the government are unable politically to deregulate and implement those supply side reforms that are required in order for us to build more homes, and that has an impact on prices and a number of other things. And when it comes to your lifestyle and the amount of sugar that you're allowed in your Coca-Cola, the price of those sugary drinks, and the way in which those products are being advertised, the way in which you're allowed to actually use them, or actually potential bans altogether. Ultimately, the size of the government has steadily increased over the past few years, and I can't see that changing. What you do at the ballot box is your business, but I think it's about advocating for the ideas also within the party. It's why we're here at Conservative Party Conference, advocating for these ideas and making them heard so they understand that we believe these things and we believe in freedom.
Okay, and Christopher.
Well, in practice, elections are won and lost based on people in a two-horse race voting for the lesser of two evils. No one holds politicians in very high esteem, so it's a matter of, do you think the other people will be even worse? On the nanny state, I suspect that Labour would be worse. I mean, Wes Streeting was the one who got this incremental prohibition idea into the news stream in Britain. There are plenty of suggestions that the Labour Party would be worse, not least because they're not going to be able to do a great deal else. They're not going to have a lot of money to spend. They won't be able to do a lot of the things that Tony Blair was able to do in 1997. And so I fear that they might go for some of these legacy securing public health policies that makes them look like they're at least changing the country in some way, good or bad. I don't know whether Labour would actually be a lot worse on this. But it's very dispiriting that there isn't a party that just stands up and says, look, I believe people should be able to live the life they choose as long as they don't harm other people.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we have finished exactly on time. I'd like to thank our host, the TPA, and to everyone from the TPA who helped put this event on. Thank you to our panel, Mark Oates, Reem Ibrahim, and Christopher Snowden. But most of all, ladies and gentlemen, thank you to you. Thank you.